From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, host of Everyday Better, an award-winning podcast dedicated to personal development. Join me every week for captivating stories and research to find more fulfillment in your work and personal life. Listen to Everyday Better on the LinkedIn Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the American Negotiation Institute's podcast, where we will teach you the skills you need to get more out of life. And now your host, Kwame Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Negotiation for Entrepreneurs. My name is Kwame Christian. I'm a business lawyer and I am passionate about teaching entrepreneurs like you how to be more persuasive and get more for your business. Before we get into this episode, I want to remind you about that free giveaway. It's a list of all of the things that are negotiable in your business and personal life. One of the main reasons why people don't negotiate is because a lot of times we don't know what is negotiable. So I made this list so you could start to identify those areas of opportunities in your own life. So if you're interested, you can get it by going to AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com/list. So that's AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com/LIST. And I'm going to put a link to that in the description of the podcast too. You may recall that at the end of the last episode, I said that I would be posting podcasts every Monday. So I'm going to be honest with you. I did that as much for me as I did it for you. So when I said that, I had about 3 episodes finished that I just hadn't gotten around to posting. So making that promise forced me to get on a regular schedule. So here's a non-negotiation related tip for you. Making public declarations of what you intend to do puts pressure on you to follow through. So I put myself in a position where it's like, okay, either you're going to post it like you said you were going to, or you're a liar. So what kind of podcast host do you want to be, Kwame? And so here we are at 9 p.m. finishing up this post. But I want to make sure that I'm giving you consistent content. So that is my ultimate goal with this. But enough about that. Let's get to the good stuff. So I'm really pumped about this interview. Paul Bolaji is going to join us from New York. Paul and I have been friends since junior high, and our relationship continues to be strong because we have very similar professional goals. I really admire Paul because he's ambitious, and we're going to hear a lot more about his business endeavors in the interview. But before we get started, I want to focus your attention on some key points he makes during the interview. Paul's going to talk about 2 business ventures. I want to focus in on his interactions with his partners. So what did he do right? What did he do wrong? And try to ask yourself, what would you have done in those situations? He also shares a lot of insight on how to handle difficult conversations and negotiations with employees and business partners. So without further ado, let's jump into the interview. I am here with one of my best friends, Paul Bolaji. He has one of the most interesting entrepreneurial and professional journeys I know. Right now, he just graduated from Columbia Law School. Is it this weekend or last weekend?
It's this Thursday.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
But yeah, let's just give the audience an idea of what it is that you did in the past and a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey.
Okay, thanks, Kwame. So prior to law school, I lived in Dallas, Texas. I was a Teach for America Corps member in 2010, and I wasn't really happy with the amount of money and the amount of experiences and learning experiences that I was having through teaching. So I actually ended up starting a company with one of my best friends from high school. And what happened was originally the idea was for a personal training company that was going to help these modern luxury apartment buildings fully utilize their state-of-the-art fitness facilities by providing their gyms and their buildings with, fully certified professional personal training staff that would conduct seminars, do consulting for them in terms of making sure that their equipment was up to date and their layout was fine. So That was the idea. And my friend at the time was living in California, and we were very close in undergrad and even growing up through middle school. So I thought it would be a great idea. And he was also a very entrepreneurial person. So I thought it would be a great idea if he came. And, since we had a close relationship, I thought that, the business would kind of grow naturally as a side to that. And boy, was I wrong. And the issue is, when you're starting companies or you have ideas, it's very easy to get excited about them and to reach out to those people that you're very close with to immediately try to jump in the boat with you and get help from them and get their support and encouragement. I mean, that's natural human nature. However, what's really, really important for people with ideas, for visionaries, for people who want to start new things, is they have to realize that their ideas are born and raised inside their heads, right? Mm-hmm. It's not something that everybody around you can necessarily see. So I think the number one foundation when you're starting anything, you're bringing anybody on board, is you need to fully understand what it is that you're doing and what you want, and you also need to fully understand that you're in control in the sense that the other people around you that are not also living in your head are not going to know exactly what it is that you're trying to get across. So to speak a little bit about that experience, what had happened was we got together, we built our business plan, we made our sales pitches, and slowly but surely we started getting business. One by one, we started signing contracts with some of the biggest apartment community managers in Dallas, Texas. And, things were great. And what happened was we got to a point where the business we got to a certain level, and the business could go one way or it could go the other way. And it being my idea, I was very sure of the direction I wanted it to go. But my partner seemed to have a different idea. And unfortunately, we weren't on the same page in terms of what those ideas looked like. And because of that, I think that there was a lot of dissonance in our communication and our understanding of the business. So what ended up happening was we got into a situation where we couldn't move forward together because we were going in different ways. As an entrepreneur, you have to realize companies are like cars. There's one driver's seat. There's one driving wheel. And normally cars are driven best with one person, right? Mm-hmm. You can have co-pilots, you can have navigation assistants, but there can only be one hand on the wheel. And when more than one hand gets on the wheel, especially when you're not in agreement about which direction you're going, I think that's where a lot of accidents occur.
Right.
So basically, our relationship got to a point where it just couldn't function. And it was difficult because of our friendship. But at the same time, knowing that, we had a business, and knowing that I had a business idea that I was trying to develop and nurture, I unfortunately put more weight and more value on, the soft factors like our friendships. Is this person still going to be my friend after this? As opposed to, really thinking logically and putting my business at the front. And I think that one of the most important lessons that I learned is when you're working with somebody, when you're managing your relationships with people that you're going to call your partners, like I said, you need to be 100% certain that you're on the same page, but you also need to make sure that they're certain that you are the driver.
That's a great point. Let me ask you this question. Were you 50-50 owners and 50-50 with decision making?
Great question. And this kind of ties back to the initial problem, is because even though I knew that this was my idea and I had laid the groundwork, I for the most part put the plan together myself, I had the vision. In order for me to really make my friend feel like he was going to have it was making sure this opportunity was going to be worthwhile for him. We did end up going 50-50 because he moved out from California to Dallas. And it seemed like the right thing to do, mainly because he was my friend. Mm-hmm. And in hindsight, that was, I think, the single biggest mistake that I made in terms, from a legal perspective, from a business perspective. You have to maintain control. You can't, and if you're not going to maintain control, you can't give it up that early. I gave it up before he even moved. I put a contract together, and that was part of the terms, was that it was going to be a 50-50 partnership. And even though we didn't really negotiate, and that's another thing that I've learned. I think is very important for young entrepreneurs, is everything is negotiable. Mm-hmm. There is nothing that is ever set in stone. And even when you're dealing with consumers, when you're dealing with partners, when you're dealing with other businesses, everything is negotiable. And everything, I mean, there's something to be said about intangible things such as goodwill, and quote unquote stacking up favors and putting that stuff in the bank. But
brace the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started today at linkedin.com/marketer. Terms and conditions apply.
From a business perspective, everything is negotiable, and it needs to be in dollars and cents. It can't be in feelings.
Let me ask you about the internal negotiations you've had with that business and the external negotiations you had with the managers at the different apartment complexes and how that went. So with the internal negotiations, what do you think you would do differently this time? Just a little bit more specific when it comes to before, when you're dividing the equity of the company and decision-making processes, and later on when you ran into those inevitable disagreements, how you would go about negotiating with the partner to make sure you're on the same page going forward.
Okay. So first and foremost, the equity structuring has to be, you have, as an entrepreneur, when you're trying to start something, you absolutely have to make sure that you have control to the point, until you get to a point where you're able to, relinquish some control. And at that time, it's about revenue, it's about getting investments. There's a time for that, but at the beginning, that's not the time. So one thing that I wish that I'd certainly, looking back, would have done, I would have renegotiated. I would have actually made a negotiation, because there was a negotiation. I just said 50-50. So first of all, understanding who the people you're dealing with, really putting an actual numerical value on what that person's skill set brings to the table. And that's another thing that I didn't do. I thought that this guy, he had experience with web design. He was a very entrepreneurial minded person. Him and I had actually worked on a couple of projects in college together. But in reality, this man didn't really bring anything to the table for a personal training, health and fitness company, besides that he was my friend and he could make a website, which lots of people can do for $10 an hour. Right. So, internal negotiations from that perspective, really being the person who's leading the valuation of the whole project, the people in the project, the actual project itself. You have to be in control. Another part of the negotiation process was the external negotiations, when we were dealing with the managers at the different places, at the different apartment communities. And that was every single complex had a different vibe, different, I think different goals in terms of what they wanted their environment to feel like for their residents. So, for example, the biggest selling point for our company was the fact that, we had created a structured, formal, professional way for these residents to utilize their fitness centers. Because prior to that, most residents could just bring in anybody they found off Craigslist who said they're a personal trainer. And I don't know if you're familiar with it. A lot of listeners might not be familiar, but Craigslist is the end-all, be-all for people who are not what they say they are. So it was just a huge liability for these people to be letting anyone people that are supposed to be nationally certified with insurance to come in without any type of verification and train the residents. So that was our biggest selling point. But on top of that, we had to feel like, okay, well, great, you're going to be able to take off that little bit of liability in the black and white. But what about in real life value? Like, what can you bring? What more value are you going to bring to our community? And in negotiations, I think one of the most important lessons that you have to realize especially when you're doing external negotiations as a business owner is, like I said, number one, everything is non-negotiable. But number two, there's always value that you can create from places where you may not necessarily see. So increasing the pie, making the pie bigger is the number one, I think, goal that you should have in your mind when you're negotiating with somebody externally. For example, there was an apartment community who had a very nice gym, but in addition to the fact that, they were willing to, happy to have this formalized structure of trainers in their gym, it was just completely a mess. And there was, they had a Smith machine directly against the wall, which made no sense. They had treadmills facing each other so that people that were running were staring directly into the face of somebody else.
That's awkward.
So just things that didn't make sense. So part of the way that we realized that we could add value to them was to completely just redesign their whole layout for them. So after we did that, they realized that the gym felt much more professional and made more sense, but they still weren't completely the value that the additional value that we could bring to them as a community. So we ended up going back to the drawing board and realized that another thing we could do would be to offer water bottles and towel service. So we got about a 6x6 shelf, and we put promotional materials on it, but we also, 2 times a week would deliver fresh gym towels and bottles of water with different sponsors from the community, different nutrition companies that were happy to do that. So we got from a place where people didn't understand, even though our bottom line wasn't, as a company, wasn't, we're going to design and help you with floor plans and do consulting. We ended up realizing that was an additional way that we could create value for a client.
Wow, that's a great point. Right. And I think that one of the most valuable skills for entrepreneurs as negotiators is the ability to be creative. A lot of times we get ourselves in this, we have this very myopic perspective, a very narrow-minded view on what it is we can offer as far as our services. We say we offer set services for a set cost, and we don't really waver on that. But you were able to find a way to kind of expand your scope of services in a way that catered to the specific needs of your customers, and that's a brilliant example.
Right.
With those additions to the service model, were you able to charge them more as a result?
So that's the thing, even though we weren't able to specifically charge them more, mainly because we didn't, we were kind of putting this together as we were going, and we didn't realize that, this is another thing that we could charge extra for. So at the time, we weren't able to monetize that with that specific client. However, when we started going into the new apartment communities, that was something else that we brought to the table, and at that time, we had realized, okay, this is something that we could actually charge people for and we could actually make more money from. Mm-hmm. So even though it didn't help us with that specific deal, it helped us moving forward, and it actually came in handy. Right.
So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to your personal professional shift from the personal trainer, the person actually delivering the services, to the owner and manager, because you were able to get to a point where you had independent contractors working for you, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So first, it really just started with me going into places and, asking them to drop off materials. And I was doing the bulk of the training. But as we grew, my time was limited, and I realized, I was able to actually get help to do what we were doing. So running a service-based company is very difficult, I learned. It's not a type of, I guess it applies to goods as well, but when you're paying somebody, when you're essentially acting as a broker or as an agent for services or goods, there's always a possibility of being sidestepped. And my biggest concern was that, I have 20 to 30 clients, people that are looking for trainers. And, going into it, I knew that, the market in Dallas, Texas, personal trainers are starting to get paid, I think, between $14 and $18 an hour. So in trying to make sure that I was going to get quality people, we set our price, our starting wage at $20 an hour to make sure that we were going to be able to, effectively get the most talented trainers, the people that were the most trustworthy, the most professional people out there. But that didn't change the fact that if you realize that, okay, Mr. Paul is paying me $20 an hour and he's charging Mr. Johnson $60 an hour for a session, why can't I just get cash from Mr. Johnson and cut Paul out? Paul's not going to be watching me all the time. So that's a very real problem that I think, people face when they're expanding service-based companies like this. And there's no way to really fully eradicate it. But my approach was when we first interviewed trainers and when we were talking to them and telling them about our vision, we tried to keep it as low to the ground as possible. I didn't speak in terms as, the company. I would say things like you and I, trying to make sure that, these potential candidates felt like I was invested in them. Just trying to build rapport with people and to make sure that they felt valued. I felt that, if you're going into this type of enterprise, their trust is got to be, you have to have people that are talented, people that are intelligent, but you also have to have people that are trustworthy, people that can trust you and people that you can trust. So building trust was the way that I tried to tackle that hurdle. And, for the most part, I think that we were successful in doing that. The problem is it's not 100% certain that we caught all those instances where people were trying to sidestep us. And it could have been more than we accounted for. But overall, the main goal was to make everybody feel valued, to make sure that people felt like they were being taken care of. So we were paying them well. We had we had biweekly meetings where we would take the staff out to dinner and just make sure that we were always on a first name basis, on a one-on-one type of level with each of our employees or each of our contractors.
Right. Oh, that's great. Were there ever any instances where somebody got out of line and you had to kind of resolve that dispute and get them to operate the way you wanted them to?
Well, so a couple of times. There's two different scenarios that stick out in my mind. First is there's a wonderful trainer, and she did a great job. All of her clients were very satisfied, but she had two children that, she oftentimes couldn't find babysitters for, and so she would actually bring her children and put them in a car seat in the gym while training her clients. And a manager at one of our communities saw that and was not happy and just thought that it was very unprofessional and brought it to my attention. And so I reached out to our trainer and I let her know that our client had concerns and that regardless of what our client thought, that wasn't really an industry best practice to bring your child to a gym while training people. So I brought it up and I couched it in a way that wasn't an attack on her, but it was in a way that, this is for the safety of your children and for the, for the appearances of professionalism for our company and for your services, for you see other people. Because the main way that trainers get clients is by, watching them. And so if you're looking professional, people are going to approach you. If you're not looking professional, if you're just there and your children are there crying while you're trying to stretch somebody out, that doesn't make you look like a very approachable trainer. Right. So we had that conversation. And she didn't bring the children back for a few weeks, and unfortunately, it happened again. And I think the main issue there was, people have problems. You have to really, as an employer, when you're leading people, you're managing people, you can't think of them as just as robots. Like, these are people with lives, with things that they're going through, and situations that sometimes are difficult for them. Like, these are human beings, just like we're human beings. We have our own issues too. So, it turned out that she just was in a very very difficult place where she wasn't able to find babysitters or afford to pay babysitters. And even though I felt that and I understood where she was coming from, we still had to let her go just for the fact that, it wasn't the image that we were trying to portray for our company. And it wasn't a bitter, by any way, it wasn't a bitter breakup. Mm-hmm. I didn't, quote unquote, tell her she was fired. I just explained to her that for our insurance policy purposes, that she wasn't even able to have her children there, and that the client, didn't want that type of environment. So we were able to amicably part ways in that regard. There was another scenario where I had a trainer that consistently would text people and be on his phone while working with clients. And I mean, if you can think about it, it would be very irritating if you're paying, $60 to $80 an hour for a professional to work you out and to teach you different things, and to have that professional be on his phone, texting people with emojis and not even trying to hide it, just doing all types of crazy things on Facebook during your 1 hour session. Wow. So that happened time and time again. And it got to the point where, that situation was different from the previous situation with our female trainer with the kids, because I think that was an example of, people having their own lives, so they actually have to, bring in to work with them, as opposed to somebody just being straight up unprofessional.
Right.
And so in approaching that situation, I felt like I needed to come in more as an authority figure, to really make sure that this trainer understood that was not an acceptable thing to do. I mean, that's one of the few things that could actually completely ruin a business of ours like that, is if their trainers are, they spend half their time on their phones while you're paying them $80 an hour. That wasn't something that was going to be able to fly. So it came in with a more authoritative tone and made it very clear that if we got such a complaint again, that would be a wrap. Mm-hmm. And in that situation, we never got another complaint again. And the trainer continued to work with his clients, and his reviews ended up getting better and better because of that. And I think that those two illustrations just kind of show that as a manager, you have to approach different issues with different people in different ways. Had I come in my first trainer, with the very authoritative one strike you're out rule, I don't think that would have been beneficial to our relationship. Not even just as a employer-employee relationship, but just as, person to person. Like, you want to always make sure that you're treating human beings like human beings. Like I think it's very easy to dehumanize people when you're, especially in business, when you're really focused on dollars and cents. It's very easy to kind of forget that people are individuals with individual stories. So, but in other situations, you have to come in with a little bit more finesse, as some of my friends would say. And other ways, you actually have to just come in with a hammer. And you have to know that what you're doing is specifically for your company. And there's certain situations and decisions that you have to make that are more directly attributed to the success of your company than it is to the success of your relationships with people. Sometimes they differ. And you just have to be able to identify situations when you're leading people to how to approach them with different types of solutions to different problems.
Yeah, those are great examples, because it just demonstrates that the ability to negotiate and resolve disputes takes creativity and flexibility too. You can't just approach every situation the same way.
Right.
Those are great points. Let's shift the conversation to your next business endeavor, the international business in China.
Okay. Right. So, essentially, after this personal training company, my partner actually, who had moved to California to Texas, put me in touch with a friend of his who was actually an educator in California that was doing some work in China with this preparatory high school that's kind of specialized in preparing Chinese students to come to American universities. So at the time, I was a high school teacher. I was with Teach for America. I was just finishing up. I enjoyed my time there, but I was ready for the next move. So I'd actually secured a job overseas, but I had about 3 months in between when I started that new job. So long story short, we decided that there was a way that we could create some synergy between my network and my friend's network in China, and helping them create curriculum for their students and also helping them staff teachers at their high school. So it got messy very quickly. And the reason it got messy very quickly was, in hindsight, I didn't really know anything about the type of person I was getting in bed with. I knew that, she was an ambitious, driven person with a big network in China who had the opportunity to help me make some money, but I didn't know anything about her as a person. But, as Richard Branson said, I said, screw it, let's do it. And jumped headfirst, got on a plane to Beijing for a 5-week project. And while we were, I don't think it took up to 4 days being in Beijing for us to get into our first disagreement. And we had signed a contract that was dictating the amount of money I was going to be paid for each teacher that I was able to successfully recruit. And apparently, when we got there seemed to have been a misinterpretation or a miscommunication between the amount of teachers based on an aggregate as opposed to individual. It was the other party was telling me that the numbers that we were supposed to be getting paid were based on if we were able to get a minimum amount in different brackets. Like if we got 5, then we get paid at a certain level. If we got 10, we got paid at a certain level. But that was never discussed in real life at all. It was just a simple, you get X amount of dollars for X amount of staff. So getting there, I had zero power. And it was a horrible place to be in terms of a negotiation, because I was in Beijing, China. I didn't know anyone. I wasn't familiar with the culture. I was living at an accommodation that my business partner had provided for me. She was essentially feeding me. She had secured my apartment that I was staying at, and I was going to be there at her mercy for the next 5 weeks.
Oh, wow.
So I had zero bargaining power. The teachers I had already brought were already there. So it wasn't like I was able to, renege on my part of the deal and say, okay, well, I'm not gonna bring teachers at this rate, because we were all already there. So I think from a negotiation standpoint, you couldn't be in a worse position. In a situation like that, where you have essentially no bargaining power or tools in your favor, and in a situation where you're completely at the mercy of the other party, what I realized, the only option that I had was to kind of reframe the whole negotiation paradigm. And I had to shift the focus of the situation that I was in right then and how we were negotiating and dealing, and to move it into a future negotiation. So basically, I told this person, I said, listen, this is what's happening now. You got me here now, great, for these 3 months, and you can go ahead and you can continue to, rewrite the terms of the contract that you had signed already under whatever pretenses you have, and realize that this, not only is this relationship between you and me completely over when this 2 months is over, but in the future, there will never be any opportunity for us to work again. And because the international education network is so small, I will make sure that people know that this is how you operate, right? So I completely shifted the focus of, her thinking that this was going to be a one-off transaction where she was going to be able to pull a fast one on me, and kind of walk her back down into a role with integrity, knowing that if you treat me well now, we have greater potential to work together to make more money and to establish a more structured long-term program in the future. And that was the only way I was able to get any type of, I don't want to call it necessarily leverage, because at that point, I really had no leverage, but I was able to reframe the whole perspective as to from changing it to from what was a summer project to creating a company out of it, something that we could continue to benefit from the other. So that alone helped us to fix the deficiencies in our current situation and also pave the way for our future dealings. And even though it sounds a little difficult because this, you've been given fair warning that the person you're dealing with can be shady, to put it nicely. At the same time, you're prepared now. So, before I sent any of my teachers to her, I was getting my money up front. I knew that going forward. So I was able to readjust my expectations after understanding this person I was dealing with, and then shift my business strategy to make sure that I was protected in different ways in the future. So that was an experience that I think could have ended horribly if I had just looked at it in a very kind of narrow, linear way, as opposed to trying to expand the pie and create more value, or the opportunity, at least the appearance of more value for the person that you're dealing with.
Right. So just to clarify, after you reframed the negotiation, were you able to get the terms to the status you thought they were in originally?
I did.
Okay. Wow.
And that was, like I said, that was the only way I think that could have happened, because otherwise I was completely at this person's mercy in a foreign country with people that weren't necessarily very friendly to people like me.
Yeah. That's interesting. And let me put my my business lawyer hat on real quick and ask you, did you have a lawyer draft up the contract that you wrote with her originally?
No, Kwame, I did not. And that was another huge mistake, is that I think a lot of entrepreneurs and small business owners make when they're starting companies or projects, is to think that they can protect themselves, or to think that they can create contracts without having professional. And that is just, I understand that everybody's trying to save money at the beginning, but that is just one way that you absolutely, one area you can't afford to cut corners on at the beginning of starting any type of venture like this. You absolutely have to make sure that you have a sound lawyer draft sound legal documents for you before you proceed. Yeah.
Yeah, it was funny. I was listening to the advertisement of another lawyer, and he said, I love sites like LegalZoom because after you pay them $50 to get your contract done and then you mess yourself up, you're going to have to come to me and you're going to have to pay me a lot more on the back end to clean up your mess. And
accurate.
It's tough because, like you said, it's not cheap to get this stuff done, but it saves so much time and frustration, and it gives you a clear vision of what's going to happen in the future when you have these contracts done professionally.
Right. And that's the cost of doing business, period.
Exactly. And I know now, for me, as thinking as a lawyer, lawyers are typically pretty risk averse. And so whenever you tell them the business situation, they can see potential problems and help to protect you beforehand. So
right. And now, coming out of law school, I look at so many things that I did in those two projects that I worked on earlier, and it's painful to look back at. It makes you want to cry, realizing how many errors and mistakes, just completely unforced errors that you make, when you're trying to protect yourself legally. There's a very good reason people go to law school for 3 years and pass a 16-hour test to be able to do what they do.
Right. Yeah. Okay, let's end with this. What is one negotiation tip you'll leave with everybody today that they can use to make their business better?
One negotiation tip, I think it's got to be creativity in defining value. I think a lot of people go into situations where they're very constricted into what they see as a potential value, and they end up missing a huge portion of what's actually available to them. And I think it's very important that people just understand that if you're going into negotiation, you know the subject matter that you're negotiating. But prior to that, you also need to identify tangential areas, ancillary, ideas or concepts that you can bring into the discussion that the other party may not have thought of, or may not have mentioned. It had not been the subject before. But in negotiations, you can bring anything to the table. The table is infinite.
Right. That's a great point. And just like you were saying, sometimes we get focused, like have a narrow-minded view on what's valuable. The other side does too. And so
Exactly.
You'll bring stuff to the table that's valuable to them that they didn't even realize they could discuss. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Paul. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Kwame.
Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed the interview. Just an update on Paul. He is less than 10 days away from taking the bar exam. So wish him well in whatever way you choose to do so. Afterward, he's going to be working at Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton in Washington, D.C. And so that's a huge accomplishment because, as you know, the longer the name, the more prestigious the firm. So if you ever need an attorney in the D.C. area, you know where to go to, Paul Bolaji. Also, if you're ever in need of negotiation coaching or consulting, or your organization is interested in trainings, please let me know. This stuff is really fun for me, and I just want to help as many people as possible. Also, my law firm operates in Ohio, so if you're in the Buckeye State and need a business lawyer, I know a guy. And lastly, I want to give a big shout out to Kobe from Cavalier Consulting for his help with producing and promoting this podcast. He's been doing an awesome job. And actually, you might get to meet him in the next episode if our schedules align. And if that happens, it's going to be a lot of fun. So keep an eye out for that. If you know somebody who would find this helpful, please share it with them. If you liked what you heard today, please subscribe to the podcast to keep up with our latest episodes and leave us a review. I love reading those, and I take your feedback to heart. And if you have any questions that you want me to cover or topics you want me to cover on this podcast, shoot me an email. I love hearing from you all, and I want to make sure that my content is relevant. So reach out to me. Let me know what you want to hear. But until then, keep on negotiating. I hope you have a great day.